Hey everyone, today I'm going to be continuing on with the series that I've been doing on military surplus rifles. I've already done my Stayer M95, and today, if you didn't already recognize it or see from the title of the video, I'm going to be doing my Mosin Nagant M9130. Right off the bat, I know that some people get really offended when you mispronounce the names of firearms made outside the United States. Just FYI, I'm going to be pronouncing it Mosin Nagant, so if you have an issue with that, please feel free to watch one of the many other Mosin Nagant videos out there. But with that out of the way, this one is pretty special to me. I know that these have been heavily produced, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. So they're not necessarily unique in of themselves. However, again, this one is special to me because this is actually the first firearm I ever purchased. I got this thing right after I turned 18. Thankfully, that was before the '08 election, so the price on these was still really, really good, at least for what you're getting. Since then, the prices have changed, and we'll talk a little bit more about the value of these things a little bit later in the video. But, you know, needless to say, being that this is the first firearm I ever owned, it has a soft spot in my heart. Did most of my early shooting with this thing, and unfortunately, it's been mostly just sitting in the safe lately because I've been shooting a bunch of other guns. But I felt it was time for this one to be brought out and do a video on. So hence why we're out here today. So what I want to do is bring you in a little bit closer so we can talk about some of the specifics of this one, along with a little bit of the history of the M9130 in general. But first, let me go ahead and see if I can get a stripper clip to work in this thing, and then we'll shoot some rounds with it. Just shooting some regular surplus. I believe these are 147 grain full metal jackets. That actually went pretty smoothly. That's not normal, but let's take some shots with this thing. All right, not the smoothest 5 rounds in the world, but we made it work. Let's take a closer look at this. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the general history of these rifles, and then tell you a little bit about what I know about this one specifically. As the name implies, these were first put into service in 1891. It was originally a design by a guy named Mosin from, I believe he was in the Russian military at the time. Basically, the Russians realized that they needed at the time, modernized bolt-action rifle in order to keep up with the people they were fighting with at the time. If you guys know anything about Russian military history, up until probably very recently, they were pretty much behind the times when it came to just military advancements. So this was really their first attempt into a magazine-fed bolt-action rifle. Now, obviously it has an internal magazine fed by a clip, which you saw at the beginning of the video, but to my knowledge, this was really the first heavily used Russian rifle that fed in this type of manner. So obviously, as the name would imply, these were also updated in 1930. They did a couple different changes to it. One of the first ones, if you can believe it, even with the excessive overall length of these things, they actually shortened the barrel by something like just over 2 inches or something like that. So these were even longer when they were first designed. One of the other changes is they went from a blade front sight to a hooded front sight. I guess they were finding that the front sight had a tendency to get damaged or knocked around without the hood, so they changed it to a hood and post design, which works okay for me. It's not the most precise sighting system of the era rifles, but it certainly is a minute of man accurate, as I'll show you here towards later in the video. One of the other things they changed was the unit of measurement for the rear sight. Again, going back to how behind the times the Russians were at the back then. They'd only recently switched over to the Gregorian calendar that the rest of the world was using, but they used their old Russian unit of measure. I have my notes right here to tell me what it is. Pretty obscure. It's the Arshins. Don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, but they switched from that over to meters, like pretty much the rest of Europe was using. And those were the major changes done in 1930. And then they did a couple different changes to the bolt, I think, but not enough to where they weren't interchangeable. Given the time frame that these rifles were produced, it was the original M91 style was used primarily by the Russians during World War I, and then the 9130s were what the primary issue rifle was to the Russians during World War II. These have seen service even all the way up to today. It's, you know, I've heard reports of even some of the rebels in Syria using these rifles. I don't know if it's as the iron-sighted version or if they have scoped versions or what, but it is still in use. The cartridge that this thing shoots is one of the only World War II era military rifle cartridges still in heavy use by a major world leader. The 7.62x54R is still used in the PKM machine gun that the Russians are using, and it's certainly a pretty stout cartridge. Ballistically, it's fairly similar to the 30-06, so that's, you know, something worth noting for those of you who, if you did want to get one of these for hunting, which I might discuss a little bit more in depth later. There's nothing in North America this cartridge couldn't take down potentially. So that's just kind of the general stuff about these rifles. As far as this one specifically, this one, and I'll roll in some close-up pictures as I talk about some of these details. This one was manufactured in 1942, so this was, you know, obviously manufactured during the war. And from what I understand, if you look at a pre-war 9130 versus one that was manufactured during the war, there are some pretty noticeable differences, like machine marks and all that. Basically, quality control requirements went down pretty well with the demand to arm the Russian military, which was pretty vast at that period of time. This one was manufactured at the Izhevsk, which again, I know I'm mispronouncing that, factory, as you can tell from the little proof mark on the receiver. And then as far as proof marks go, this thing is covered in proof marks, whether it be on the receiver itself. The stock, I know, has a bunch of markings, and there's a lot of places where you can look into what different markings mean. But I've tried looking up what some of the numbers and symbols mean, and I can't find anything out there. But, you know, you'll see the pictures, and if you guys know, feel free to share your knowledge in the comment section. There's a lot of really good resources for some of the more common markings, like the factory markings or the markings indicating, you know, if they were captured by whatever countries. And there's some resources for that online. I'll have links to where you can see some of those. But again, some of these are, you know, so crazily marked that it's hard to know exactly what the history of each individual rifle was. Now, one thing worth noting that I didn't mention when I was talking about the general history of these, about 17.5 million of these were produced, including quite a few made here in the United States. Before the October Revolution over in Russia, their manufacturing couldn't really keep up with the demand, so they actually contracted a couple companies here in the U.S. to manufacture these rifles. So it is possible to get rifles like this that were manufactured by either Remington or Westinghouse. Good luck finding those. I'm pretty sure you know, most of those are in private collections. Because obviously there's going to be a little bit more of a cool factor with those. And from what I understand too, after the October Revolution, Vladimir Lenin basically told the United States that, well, I'm not going to pay for those rifles. So the United States military actually got some very limited use of these rifles in some like National Guard branches and some very specialty units. So these actually did see service in the United States military, but I'm sure that was in a very limited capacity. So with some of those main points out of the way, I'm going to bring the camera in a little bit closer still, and I'm going to show you some of the specifics on this rifle, some of the features it has, and some of the pros and cons that I can find in those features. So we're going to go ahead and start from the back of the rifle and work our way forward. As you'll see here, you have a nice metal butt plate here, which is great if you're doing, you know, any sort of combatives with your rifle, whether it be butt strikes or anything like that. But obviously not the most ergonomic thing in the world, in my opinion. Thankfully, things have come a long way. Now, granted, the nice things like rubber or anything that might help with the recoil of these was, you know, needed elsewhere in the war efforts, especially at that time in the world. So it's not, it's pretty common to see the metal butt pads on these old military surplus rifles. You'll see a sling loop back here. Now most rifles that you buy are going to come with the cotton sling. I don't have it attached to this thing right now, but you do have that sling loop right there. Moving forward to the bolt. The bolt does have a safety, but it's not one that's very easy to use. You have to pull back here, and I'm not even sure if I'm going to be able to demonstrate this, but you have to pull back and rotate it counterclockwise about 45 degrees. And it's not very easy to do. As you can see, I'm having a really hard time with it. To the point where if I had been a Russian soldier during World War I or World War II, I probably would not have used the safety. It's just such a pain to get on, and then it's even harder to get off. And the last thing I want to do if I'm under fire, you know, especially fighting in the streets of Stalingrad or something like that, last thing I want to do is be fighting with my safety in order to be able to return fire or, you know, initiate an ambush or whatever I'm doing. You can see that it has a straight bolt knob, which you know, some people like, some people don't like. On the iron-sided versions, it's not a huge issue. Obviously, if you've seen ones in the sniper configuration, they did cut the bolt off and basically mount it at a close to 90-degree angle so that it could clear a scope once it was moved up like that. And it does have a 90-degree rotation, which again is not uncommon. However, you know, things like the Enfield had a much shorter throw. So if you guys have seen some other people's videos out there, one of the things they mention about rifles, really other than the Enfield, at least era rifles, is you cannot maintain a sight picture. Even if the bolt did clear your face with a cheek weld, you could not maintain a sight picture while you're actuating the bolt. So you have a 90-degree throw. It comes back, and it does cock on opening. So let me go ahead and demonstrate that here. You'll notice back here, as I cycle the bolt up, it does cock it back, which again is pretty much how you're normally going to see most bolt actions run. Again, to reference the Enfield, that's really one of the few ones that I know of, at least of the era, where that one cocked on closing, which is a really unusual feeling if you're not used to it, but this one's going to be pretty much the standard in that respect. When I picked this up, it was still a really plentiful rifle, really easy to find, really inexpensive. So I was able to essentially hand pick of the selection that they had at the store where I purchased it. So this one actually has a really smooth bolt compared to some of the other ones I felt out there. Now, it's definitely not the smoothest bolt of era rifles, but as far as Mosin Nagants go, this one has a really nice bolt. I haven't done any polishing to it, which is worth noting. All I did was clean out the Cosmoline, lightly oil it, and everything's been fine since. Now, the magazine, one of the other things that they changed with the 91 to the 9130s was the magazine spring was actually affixed to the floor plate here. On the 9130s, originally they were just loose in there. They obviously found that if the troops ever had to open the magazine for any reason, whether they're clearing malfunctions or anything like that, there was a tendency for the soldiers to lose their spring. So that's obviously not something you want. So they did affix it to the floor plate to alleviate that issue. The magazine does hold 5 rounds, and as you may be able to see here on the top, there is a channel for those stripper clips like you saw at the beginning of the video. Again, if you know, obviously if I was a troop, if I was in the Russian or Soviet army, I would probably be using the stripper clips since that's how the ammunition was issued typically. Generally, I don't use it because they can be a pain. I got lucky at the beginning of the video. Normally they don't go in that easy, but just something to keep in mind. Moving forward, we have up here, we have your rear sight. The rear sight, like I said, is on the 9130s is done in meters. You have everything from the 100 meter zero, and then that goes all the way up to a very optimistic 2000 meter graduation, which you know, granted, if you think about the military doctrine at the time, it's not uncommon. On a lot of World War I, World War II era rifles, you'll see graduations that go up that high. From what I understand, that's really just kind of a holdover from the you know, Napoleonic era of fighting, where you have large groups shooting en masse at other large groups. If you have, you know, 200 people shooting at a large group of people, Maybe you'll get a couple hits at 2,000 meters, but I still think that's pretty darn optimistic. You're not going to have any sense of accuracy at that point. Now moving forward here, you can see we have one band back here that holds the upper wood section here down to the rest of the stock. We have another sling loop here, which corresponds with that one in the rear, and then we have front band, again keeping those two tight together. The fitment on mine is a little bit loose, so typically what I'll even find myself doing is forcing this band even further back behind the little spring for it. That seems to hold it in place better, but obviously that's not the way it was intended. Moving forward still, we have a cleaning rod, as you'll see. However, I'm going to demonstrate an issue with that here in a second once I zoom back out. And then we have the hooded front sight, which is adjustable for windage. You can see it's got pretty much a dovetail setup in there, so you can drift it left or right if you need to for windage. This one seems to be pretty well zeroed with the military surplus ammo that I've been shooting out of it. So, you know, that's definitely a good thing. Now you can get bayonets for these. I believe mine did come with a bayonet. You know, I never plan on using one on a rifle like this. However, if you are going to get a rifle like this, you might as well get it just, you know, to have kind of a complete set for one of these rifles. But I don't see a whole lot of use for it. However, if I was going to use a bayonet on a rifle, it is nice having it on a rifle this long, because if I'm getting to the point where I have to poke someone with a long stick, I want the longest stick of anyone in that fight. So this will pretty much do that for you. So now that we've covered pretty much everything about this, let's go ahead and zoom out and I'll show you the problem with this cleaning rod. So if we take this cleaning rod out, unscrew it from its home, really the only thing, unless you have a cleaning kit that you can use this for, would maybe be knocking out a stuck casing. However, as you'll see, I have the bolt closed currently. So for all intents and purposes, that bolt is as forward as the rear of the case would be on a stuck casing. So let's say I want to use this to knock that casing out. You may see here that it actually goes all the way into the barrel. So unless you want to just kind of chuck it in there over and over, you're probably not going to get a really stuck casing out. Now obviously if you have the cleaning kit, it's going to come with, you know, the little attachments for this little screw down end to be able to reach that, but this one didn't come with a cleaning kit. If you do get a cleaning kit, then I guess more power to you, but just something to keep in mind. So unless you actually have the military issue cleaning kit, there's not a whole lot of reason to keep this on your rifle. Unless you guys have a reason, in which case definitely let me know. So in order to test the accuracy of this rifle, I went ahead and shot it at both 100 and 200 yards, some B-27 style silhouette targets, just to see what kind of accuracy I was able to get on a low contrast target like you would get in a combat situation on a silhouette style target. Now, one of the big problems is going to be a consistent point of aim. So take that into account, especially when we're looking at the 200-yard target. I'll talk a little bit more specifically there before I show you that target. And I just want to, for full disclosure, tell you some things that are working against this rifle to show that, you know, while these are my results, I'm sure there are some rifles out there that can do better. So just to preface, one of the things is I know this thing does not have a good bedding job. You can literally feel, as you pull the trigger back, you can feel the entire receiver slide back in the stock. Just kind of one of the symptoms of it being a war production rifle, where a lot of that QC stuff was just thrown out the window in order to get those rifles out as fast as possible. One of the other problems was with this rifle, when I got stationed over in England for 2 years, pretty early on in my time over there, my brother asked me if he could borrow that rifle to do some shooting with it, and so I said yes. And he clearly did not do a very good job cleaning it after shooting some corrosive ammo. And so when I got home after 2 years, over in England, I take a look inside the bore, and the entire barrel is just covered in a frosting of rust. Now, I've done a lot to try to get most of that out, and it seems to be shooting okay, but I'm sure if that hadn't been the case, it'd probably be shooting even better. So just to preface that, this is representative of my rifle, but I'm sure there are rifles out there that can shoot better. So with all the excuses out of the way, first I'll show you my 100-yard target. So again, I'm shooting at a all black silhouette here. using black iron sights. So again, my point of aim, I tried to be as consistent as possible, but it is what it is. I seem to have, just for ease of showing you here, let me fold it up. I have 3 shots right here. I have 3 shots right here in about 3 inches, or as I tell my girlfriend, about 6 inches right here. And then my other 2 shots were pretty far off considerably. Altogether, that's probably about a 10-inch group, but I think this is a little bit more representative. And just FYI, I was shooting the military surplus. I think it's 147 grain full metal jacket. Probably not the most consistent ammo anymore after, however many years it's been in storage. I was getting velocities all over the place, so take that into consideration. But I had 3 shots, again, around 3 inches, and then an overall group of about 10 inches. I think that that's probably a little bit more representative of it. And moving out to 200 yards, the results were a little bit more interesting, we'll say. So I have just regular, the original iron sight setup that came with that rifle. I know there are people who will put like a finer front post on it. And basically at 200 yards on this silhouette, the front post took up the entire width of the silhouette. So it was a little bit more difficult to get a consistent point of aim. And, so it is what it is. I shot 5 shots at this target, and I have 1 up here in the shoulder, 1 right here, 1 here in the belly button, then 1 off here to the side, and I genuinely don't know where the 5th one went. If I had to guess based off the trend of where these shots were, is probably somewhere off to the right. So 4 out of 5 shots at 200 yards. It seems to be kind of more or less minute of man accurate at those distances, but obviously I think there are some modern options in a similar price range that can do a little bit better than that. So again, can you get a rifle that'll shoot better? Yes, absolutely. This is just representative of mine, and then based on the skill of the shooter and how familiar you are with your iron sights and your rifle setup, it can probably make a little bit of a difference as far as how those groups look, especially at those longer ranges. And again, as far as the minute of man accuracy stuff, a while back I was shooting at some, I think it was shoot steel targets at, I think it was 120 yards with this rifle and then my buddy's K31, and had no problem hitting a silhouette at those distances regularly over and over. But I think once you start pushing out, those iron sights start showing their limitations a little bit and making it a little bit harder to get good consistent grouping at those distances. At this point, I'm going to try to do my best to wrap up my thoughts about this rifle. Now, when I first got this, it seemed to be more the case, a little bit less so now, but there were people who were basically trying to make it sound like if you needed a life and liberty gun, or you needed a shit hits the fan gun, the Mosin Nagant M9130 is the gun for you. Now, when these were $100 a piece and you could get a tin of ammo for about $100 also, I may have been more sympathetic to that argument. But now that these are on the low end, $250 on up, if you want like the scoped versions from, built by the Soviet armorers, you're looking at like $600-700 maybe for a good one. Plus the fact that you can't get large amounts of surplus ammo anymore, at least at a decent price. I don't think that that's the case with these rifles anymore, at least in respect of them being a good life and liberty gun or shit hits the fan gun. I just honestly think that there are better options, especially at that price range. And even considering now at this point in time, you can get a budget AR for around $500. So if you can just save up a little bit more money, you can have a box-fed semi-automatic rifle, and one that's going to have readily accessible accessories, ammo, parts, anything you want is going to be a lot more readily accessible than something like this. One of the problems with this versus the modern rifles out there now, you don't really have a good optic mounting system unless you get one that comes with that gunsmith mounted scope. If you get one of these and you want a decent setup, it's probably going to cost a little bit of money to get those scope mounts added on, and then you have to do alterations to your bolt. If that's worth it to you, then hey, more power to you. But again, for the price and time and effort, you can probably do a little bit better. Now, I know there's companies like UTG that make optic mounts for these, but I'll be damned if I'm ever going to trust my life to anything that says UTG or NC Star or anything like that. If that makes some of you butthurt, then I'm sorry. Go train with your stuff and see if it holds up to some rigorous use. But, you know, even from a tactical standpoint, it's going to be really hard to gain fire superiority or maintain continuity of fire unless you have a lot of these rifles all pointed in the same direction. And realistically, that's not a feasible option for most people out there. I mean, there's a reason that modern militaries are not using 5-round bolt-action rifles as their standard issue rifles to their militaries. Now, does that mean that there's no use for these rifles? Absolutely not. You know, as I said, this was the first rifle I ever bought, and I never plan on getting rid of this thing. It's got that soft spot in my heart. And then also, I just appreciate the history of firearms like this. Even though they're obsolete, and I know some of you are going to be mad to hear that word, most of those old rifles are still plenty of fun to shoot. You know, and you've seen one already on this channel, and you'll probably see more. I already have lined up a Swiss K31 and a Enfield No. 1 Mark III that I'm going to be showing here on the channel before too long, and I hope to expand that even more. So with that, if you guys have recommendations for other military surplus style rifles, go ahead and throw those in the comment section down below. I know there are a couple other variants of the Mosin Nagants that I plan on getting my hands on. One is like the Finnish M39s. Those are, you know, going to be basically an accurized version by the Finns version of these 9130s. I also plan on getting my hands on an M44, which is basically a cut down version of these rifles. Unfortunately, they came pretty late in the war, so they didn't get see a whole bunch of use. But nonetheless, I definitely want to get my hands on one and roll one in front of the camera. Now, I know there are going to be some Mosin Nagant fanboys out there who are probably a little bit butthurt by the things that I just said about these rifles, and I'm sure you're already typing away furiously in the comment section, so go ahead and let me know what you think about it. But in my opinion, I just think there are better options if you're looking for a life and liberty gun than the Mosin Nagant. Even there are some pretty inexpensive 30-06s, 308s, things where the ammo is going to be much more readily available, cheaper to shoot, and parts are going to be a lot more available for as well than a rifle like this. Now, not to say that there's not companies still manufacturing ammo for these. Like I said before in the video, they are still using the 7.62x5.4R round over in the former Soviet Union countries, and there are even companies like Hornady making hunting loads for these rifles. You can get soft point bullets and ballistic tip bullets all you want. Going to be a little bit harder to find. You're probably not going to find it at your local store. You're going to have to special order it, but it is out there, so that's a good thing. So, and I also want to make it clear, I'm not trying to badmouth these rifles. I'm not trying to badmouth any of them old military surplus World War I, World War II era rifles. I just think to overblow their relevance into the type of fighting that goes on in the world today is a little bit disingenuous. So if you have your own experiences with these rifles, go ahead and let me know down in the comment section down below. I'm always anxious to hear what you guys have experienced with your own firearms out there. And again, if you have suggestions for other rifles like this that you want to see on the channel, go ahead and leave those in the comment section down below. But with all that said, as always, I hope you're able to get something out of this video, and I really appreciate you watching.